Доброго дня всім, хто завітав до нас на другу подію M17 International Collectors Forum. Сьогодні в нас триває другий день, і наступна лекція буде від Пітера Дорошенко. Ця подія називається «Поза межами его та грошей. Майбутнє приватних колекцій». Мені б хотілося представити нашого наступного спікера. Пітер Дорошенко відомий на Україні. Це американський куратор українського походження, виконавчий директор Музею сучасного мистецтва Dallas Contemporary США і автор книги «Приватний простір для сучасного мистецтва». Це одна з його книжок, яка нас особливо зацікавила, яка присвячена і темі колекціонування, і, я так розумію, і відносинам колекціонерів, музеїв, інституціям. Я думаю, що якраз у Пітера є великий досвід співпраці з реорганізацією колекціонерів у підтримку культури, мистецтва, музейних інституцій. І тому участь Пітера для нас дуже важлива, як людини, яка має такий величезний досвід співпраці як з українськими колекціонерами, так і зарубіжними, і взагалі досвід от роботи в Україні і за кордоном. Я б також хотіла додати, що Пітер у 2003-2005 роках був директором Бельгійського міського музею сучасного мистецтва в Генті у Бельгії, також обіймав директорські та кураторські посади у ряді інших мистецьких інституцій в США. Тобто Пітер, ми дійсно щасливі, що ви нам приділили увагу нашій події, і я впевнена, що і Український клуб колекціонерів сучасного мистецтва, і всім нашим слухачам ваш досвід, ваші поради будуть дуже важливі. Я б хотіла вам передати слово і знов таки ж оголошую назву лекції і теми «Поза межами его та грошей. Майбутнє приватних колекцій». Пітер Дорошенко.
Дуже дякую. Дякую, що запросили. Це є така тема приватні колекції. І як колекціонери відчиняють музей перед тим, що я до Даллас переїхав 10 років тому назад, то багато пам'ятаю, що я з Сашою Соловйов працювали у Віктор Пінчука, у Пінчук-арт-центрі. Я був перший президент, і там чуть-чуть на 4 роки був у Києві. То я за друзів скучаю, але будемо за цікаву тему говорити. Також по нашій тут лекції, що буду розкладати, то є багато такі нюанси і слів, то я буду по-англійському, що багато легше буде, і то добре, що є переводчик помогти. Але при кінці буде цей Q&A, і як хтось має питання, то ніякі проблеми тоді назад на українську мову перейти. То дякую, і зараз починаємо лекції. I would like to set the tone for today's time that we spent together on dealing with collections, where they are, where they have been, and where they're going. In preparation for today's talk, I came across some questions on asking collectors and working with collectors on what the next steps are. 10 years ago, right when I left Kyiv, and something that was completely written and produced in Kyiv and published in Brussels in 2010, was a book called Private Spaces for Contemporary Art. And it was the largest and still is the only book on private collectors who open up their own spaces or their own museums, private museums. And it is available on Amazon and in certain bookstores. It's easy to find online. but it really kind of sets a precedent for what has changed in the art world, how institutions have changed, and this new paradigm, which is a private museum, how it functions and enters the ecosystem of museums and art and contemporary art. So I came across some questions which I thought I would start out with, because these are the questions that when I was writing the book over 12 years ago, I asked, some of the best collectors, the biggest collectors, the most active collectors, global collector, on why. Some of the questions that came up were, what are your reasons behind opening a space to show and house your collection? And it sounds so elementary and easy, but a lot of this question brought up a whole conversation. And in the book, I have over 7 interviews actually, with some of these collectors. And it was not easy for them to answer even a basic question like that. I mean, they did have a reason behind it. And as in my title, sometimes it's the ego, sometimes it's the money, sometimes it's both the ego and the money. But it's something that always starts there. Then I was always curious on, are you open to the public, free and open to the public? And if you're not free, what do you charge and why? I was always fascinated with, certain collectors have such large egos that they feel that whatever works of art they do have and they house in their private spaces or museum, that they would charge a fee like a city or government museum would, which has less money. And so I was always interested in the economics of why fees would be charged for a private collector when he or she are billionaires or millionaires. So it always kind of like fascinated me, and it's incorporated in my book. And still, even to this day, it's a central part to many of the private collections and these private spaces. Then another question is what is achieved in the space for your artists and your community? Sometimes that's not even thought about by a lot of collectors. They buy it because they either like the art, they're passionate about contemporary art, they have a knack for collecting. It's a personal kind of psychological connection. But what do they give back in return for those of us that aren't part of that psychological process or aren't part of that economics, socioeconomic structure that they live in? There's interesting questions. I mean, interesting questions that I've always asked even to today, maybe not in the way I formulated here, but in general, questions I do ask a lot of people that tell me, oh, I'm opening a private museum, or I have a space to show my museum, or I've created an office and my collection is going to be in my office and it's going to be a very private space. Then I have 4 other questions that I usually follow up with is, does opening a private space come out of passion for art, or this whole aspect of a personal ego? And a lot of people, Francois Pinault would answer yes. He has answered in the past, yes, it's about my ego, but it's also about learning. And during the collecting process, I learned so much, but obviously I want to show the world what I've collected, and this is a unique opportunity to do so. Others are less open about why they have a private space and their passion for collecting, or is it an ego kind of exercise? So it really kind of depends. Then following that up, it's, is this all about business? 95% of private collectors are business people. He or she have started a successful business. they've always collected art or created an interest in collecting art. And then as the business grew, their collecting grew, and hence the unique opportunity to kind of create a space that they feel comfortable with the right politics and the right focus and control. And it's a fair question to ask. How does this tie into your business? Then what are the working dynamics for that benefactor or that collector? Are they very focused? Are they very emotional? Are they very, do they have high expectations and goals? Each one is, just like we all are, quite different, but they do have major impacts and influence on how these kind of private institutions function, and they always exist until that benefactor's basically death, until the end. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on the structure and life and death in private museums, but it's just working dynamics are important. Then the last question is, do private institutions offer more or less artistic freedom? Now, in theory, we would all, if I was there with you and I asked for a show of hands, does it offer more artistic freedom? Probably everybody would raise their hand. Yes, it offers. Not necessarily, because a lot of private museums are tied, as I discussed the question earlier about business. You need to be careful to your audience and to protect your business. And sometimes the business runs in the same parallel as the collection or the space. And the freedom to do something unique or experimental or to risk failure are much lower than, say, a public institution where addressing specific topics or themes, if necessary, can be done for the greater cause of the community or society at hand. So those are just some questions I'm going to start out with and to keep in mind, and will be kind of further talked about over the next few minutes, but important questions to ask. Then I wanted to kind of start out that, the whole aspect of private museums and spaces is nothing new. But they really have kind of accelerated and taken their own strata in the contemporary art world, as I mentioned earlier, probably in the mid-1980s, the late 1980s, and definitely well on their way in the early 1990s. So basically about 30 years, plus or minus. They started both in the United States and Europe. Obviously, these were kind of personal decisions that were made by collectors or philanthropists, those that want to help culture or contemporary art, who are disillusioned by supporting traditional museums. Many of these individuals were on different boards at public institutions, and they would give money, and they would give art, and they would really want the institution to succeed, but they would see, almost everybody has told me, they saw no results. They would give X amount of money every year, and they would see no results. They would give their collection, and barely anything was ever shown. And then, after 4 to 6 to 8, some even 15 years of doing so, just gave up on public institutions, and decided there's got to be a better way. I need to do this myself. I need the control. I've tried to be supportive, but it's not working out. One of the most earliest and famous is Richard Seymour Conway, who started the what we now know as the Wallace Collection in London. It's something that he, acquired work from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. His later son, Sir Richard Wallace, where the collection is named after, upon his death, created with the government of the United Kingdom a structure to house the collection in the premises where it is now for perpetuity. And that has always been kind of like a very classic, very important model on how collections can stay together, obviously be put together, evolve, and then stay together. Later, in my personal experience as a student in Chicago, I had the pleasure of meeting Daniel Terra, who was also a industrialist, a collector of American Impressionism art, so very, very focused, and was involved with the Art Institute of Chicago, a world-class organization. But once again, no matter how he got involved, no matter how much money he gave, no matter how many important paintings he donated to the museum, he saw no impact. The museum is so big, it's hard to have instant access or gratification with engaging in an organization at that scope. And he then opened a private museum in Chicago on one of the most important streets, Michigan Avenue, right in the middle of the city, bought a building, turned it into a museum. I had the privilege of going to the opening because my professor at the time was his curator. He hired her as his curator. And I went and had a delightful conversation. And, he said the same thing he wanted to see results. He wanted to see things happening quickly. He was already in his 70s, and he said he could not wait 10 or 20 years to see something important happen with American Impressionism. And so, but also at the same time, as a student, you go, you talk, it's fascinating, it's a new kind of concept, but the papers and the criticism that the institution received, and that was the Terra Museum of American Art. At the time, that was the name. Now it's called the Cartier Foundation, and they give grants around the world to organizations that do scholarship or exhibitions about American Impressionism. But at the time, it was so criticized in the United States by all the different media, especially the larger ones, such as the newspapers, Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, a lot of business newspapers, really criticized this whole aspect of a private space. Well, obviously, Daniel Terra knew something that a lot of the newspapers did not, because the museum flourished. It had, at the time, many visitors, and it signaled to other collectors, at least in the United States and possibly in Europe, that you can do this. You can, if you have the financial resources, open up a private museum and do it in the right way, and to kind of mimic what private museums or public museums are doing in a private setting. Later, the real estate billionaire Eli Broad from Los Angeles took notice of what Daniel Terra did and started his plans for opening a museum. And not only would he open he would open many museums, some public, some semi-public, private, and of course, the Broad Museum, now currently open in Los Angeles, which is completely private. So he was one who tried many different paths with public institutions and private venture with his own work, and I think had a good time along the way. Also extremely praised yet criticized in doing this over the last 30, 35 years. but obviously had, at least in the United States, made a major impact, and still does with a lot of private collectors. At least here in the United States, I thought I would bring up that many private museums, it's once again not a new concept, have been around and started, especially in the early 20th century, and then slowly morphed or changed into kind of charities or non-for-profits, as we call it, where it's public-private. There's a board in charge of the institutions. They're all private individuals. They're financially responsible for the organization, no different than the one I work at here in Dallas, the Dallas Contemporary. So they either have to donate the funds to operate the institution or find the funds to operate the institution with the staff. They hire the staff, they work with the staff. And so, many names such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, started by Gertrude Whitney as a social club, and then a small little museum, and then a medium museum, and then obviously a large museum. Then the Guggenheim, which also started as a private collection and then morphed into a traditional museum that we all visit now in New York. And then in California and Los Angeles, John Paul Getty turned his home, which is a beautiful villa, into basically an institution, and really kind of changed the way we look at collections in a private home, no different than Richard Wallace did with his father's collection in London, into kind of a new model to work off of. And then later the Getty morphed, because of their collection, it was so great, by opening a beautiful museum a few kilometers away, and really kind of making the proper impact of what the collection was. So once again, these models and this kind of new paradigm is not new, and it has been with us for quite a long time. But over the course of their histories, over the course of their lives, they do morph, they do change, they become, to a certain extent, some of them hybrids. And it all, I believe, starts with the individual who is the collector, who takes that impetus to make that first step to start not only a collection, but also to create a premises or a kind of a space for those collections. The current structures for contemporary art organizations, and it's a global process, including Ukraine, is there are government-run institutions, there are smaller artist-run institutions, small associations of individuals, like-minded individuals who like contemporary art and want to kind of create a new vision or create a new pathway for their interests. Then, as I mentioned before, the more Anglo-Saxon model, non-for-profit institutions, or in the United Kingdom, it's called charities, which are board-driven, a group of individuals working with the professional staff. And then once again, why we're here is the whole aspect of a private space. One question I'm always asked quite a bit is, okay, I get the difference between the public and the private, but do private museums have boards, much like almost all public institutions do? And the answer is yes, some do and some don't. Some have advisory committees, some have a group of friends of the collector, and some don't. Some collectors don't want to be bothered. It's not in the way they work or the way they think. Committees just slow them down. They're fast decision makers. So it goes the full gamut from one extreme to the other, where there are a lot of private institutions that run and operate like public institutions. And there are some that are very quick, very speedy, and don't have that kind of governing mechanism in place. A collection is always tied to wealth, wealth safety, taxes, the movement of capital. And that's been the case since, Richard Seymour Conway started the Wallace Collection, 150 years ago. That does not change. It's not something a lot of people feel comfortable talking about, but it is something where, from the Medicis were not a poor family. The reason they were able to engage some of the finest artists of their time was because they had wealth. And the same is true with the various private collections around the world, is that without the wealth, without a proper management of that wealth against, fluctuations, taxes, governments, revolutions, et cetera, it would be a lie to say that it's not a topic many people want to talk about, but it's there, and I think we need to address it. Every collector has a C or a group of financial advisors and bankers involved. So each private collection, you may not see them, they may not visit the museum, you may not know their name, or they may not support the space, but they're there. And they're there obviously to create good decision-making on the support, on the collectors and the benefactors side. But it's something that exists, and once again, unpleasant, but there. The same with public relations. I'd say it's the second focus with advertising agencies, PR companies, which sometimes are, once again, an offshoot to the collector's business. And every business needs good PR. That's how they make money. That's how things work. The same is attached to the private spaces. You want good PR. You want to create a good aura, a positive vibe for what you're doing, why you're doing it. Because if it's all negative and it's all tainted, nobody's going to come. And it creates a riff, not only for the ego, but also a riff for, working in your community. So that's definitely there. Also, the size and the scope of the organization, with these strange and different dynamics, change over time. I mean, it's like a living organism. And, some things grow, some things get smaller, new directions are found, new pathways, a lot of risk-taking is involved. And through that risk-taking, certain things happen very quickly, and certain things don't happen at all or fail completely. And so that, I believe, is probably more so the case than obviously with public institutions, which are a little bit more cautious, take a little bit more time. The staffs, be it directors or curators or educators, try to do it the right way the first time, as where sometimes a emotional kind of decision on a collector's part is a winner. It has instant success, or it could fail. And I think as business people, they don't mind either or. Obviously, they like the winning part, but I think failing is part of their DNA or their lifestyle, and they're not afraid of it. So, it's with this kind of context, with this kind of new way of organizing institutions, It's all about new ways of operating systems and structures, which once again are somewhat familiar to us, but very familiar to the collector, because obviously they go and do their research and their homework on how institutions, public institutions function, and they try to mimic that to their business goals and their personal goals. And that is, I think, the hardest part, even though many collectors do feel they know everything about museums, and that's not always the case, but that's how they start out. And, it ultimately comes down to complete control. The only reason why almost everybody starts a private institution is to do it better than public institutions. At least that's in the mindset. And so control is paramount. And it's the most important thing. And it's really about positioning and messaging in the right way, and really trying to make an impact with the works that you have, or with a program that you're interested in doing. And that's the impetus for everybody that starts a space. At times, there is a little differentiation between the company, as I mentioned, and a museum. Sometimes the museum is in the corporate headquarters. That happens a lot in Austria. That has happened in Switzerland. Still is happening in Switzerland, or the museum is right next to the company headquarters, such as in Liechtenstein. There's many, different ways that corporations and benefactors do it. Each one is unique, and that could be done as simple Google on various organizations. I would say, harking back to where I started, the hyper movement in private institutions from Miami to Munich really took hold in the 1990s. And it was a very strange time. The Miami is probably the focal point for a lot of private collectors, because for different reasons, many collectors, industrialists moved to Miami or had a second home, and they immediately got involved in the local museum, which was a contemporary art museum called the Fine Arts Center, which is a non-collecting museum. And with the director at the time in 1992, Louis Grouchos, who's now in Santa Fe, they wanted to turn that non-collecting Kunsthalle museum into a collecting museum with their collections. So there were three individuals: Marty Margulies, who collects photography, but also sculpture. Then you have Don and Mira Rubel, who pretty much collect everything from the 1980s to the present and in depth. And then you had Carlos and Rosa de la Cruz, that really focused in on artists that made an impact for them. And were very interested in, especially a lot of the German artists from the 1970s to the 2000s. And so all three got together with the director and went on a weekend to New York on a private jet. It all sounds wonderful. They were supposed to be, working with the director to create a unique opportunity to show all three collections in this museum. Well, it went horribly bad. And over the course of the weekend, the disagreements and the kind of unfocused nature of their discussions really ended this prospect of having this institution become collecting with these three collections. So they all went their own way. And I was very fortunate to go to Miami about a week after this happened, because the director was a friend of mine, and I got together and he said, "This is the most horrible thing that has ever happened to me." And I told him things happen for a certain reason. And sure enough, literally 30 years later, just about 30 years later, these individuals went and created some of the most dynamic collections and institutions which are kind of a watermark for how others can collect around the world. And they're also created certain hotspots for private museums, such as in the city of Miami. Here in Dallas, there's many. After Miami, I would say Dallas is second biggest center for collections. Not as public. They don't like to show off. Some people have private spaces that are not even open to the public, unlike Miami. Los Angeles has some of the biggest collections, but very, very public. Dusseldorf, where they go from the Goetz collection, which is almost like a gem, a jewel box, a very small museum, to larger institutions outside the Langer Foundation, which is in a Tando building. Beautiful, beautiful space. Milan, over the last 25 years, has exploded. Most recently, 3 years ago, the Prada Foundation moved into their new expanded campus of buildings. Shanghai is the new Miami for Asia, where there's such an interest and a public need for contemporary art that it's really changing very quickly. Also, a fun fact is that a private museum opens up in China every month, and that's what we know. That's what research. There could be even more. It's a lot. China has now. When I did the book, there were 18 to 20 organizations 11 years ago. Right now, there are over 220 private museums in China. Once again, they are some of them are very specific. Some just deal with ceramics from a particular province. Some deal with full-on contemporary art, much like the Broad or other major collections around the world. And then lastly, Singapore, because it is a financial capital in Asia, has attracted a lot of private collectors or financial individuals that became collectors and then are now quietly opening up spaces and really kind of taking it to the next level. But with these changes in the kind of traditional art structures that exist, there's definitely a blurring of what is public and what is private. Some institutions, like the ones in China really has public spaces, public museums, but people don't really kind of think about it. They don't think like what is private, what is public. They're just interested in viewing artifacts, history, bits of culture. And, if they go to a private contemporary space, they're just excited to be there. They're excited to possibly see something that they've seen in a book or most likely on the internet, something that's in the news possibly. And not just in China, everywhere, the whole aspect of the public going to either private or public museums, the differentiation, unless a private space makes it very concrete that we are private, is being blurred. And like I mentioned earlier, I ask a lot of collectors, why do you charge a fee? Like a lot of public spaces. And they like that blurring. A lot of them tell me they don't want to be seen differently than the city museum or the government museum or the provincial museum. They want to be just a museum. And to blur that and to make it very easy for visitors, they feel that they do have to charge a fee, that free is not good, that people take worth and they have a better experience when they do have to pay. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it is what it is. And that's something that exists there. Private collections and their spaces, really also, as I mentioned, the fee mirror their collectors' ambitions. And so a lot of, these kind of the way they operate, or they blur the lines, or what they collect, it's really an extension of the collector, the benefactor. And some are very robust, very wild, very bold, and some are very timid, very quiet, very academic. So, that's something always to keep in mind, because you will walk into a space which is very geared to research, let's just say, for example, in Munich, and it's like a library. You go in, you have to make an appointment, somebody will help you out, they'll post things out. It's very, very different. Other organizations, like the Zubakovich collection in London, they don't do that. They don't have the staff. That's not their focal point. They curate 1 or 2 exhibits a year of emerging artists in the UK and from around the world. You like it, great. You don't like it, they're okay with that too. So it goes from one extreme to another on the roles that they fulfill. But the benefactors that's what it's all about. It's really about mirroring what their interests are. I'm always asked, about this whole aspect of programming, budgets, and visitor experiences. They basically, a lot of people tell me, oh yeah, at the Pinchuk Art Center, how did the programming work? What were the budgets? Everybody's always interested in budgets, especially if a billionaire or a millionaire is running or started the organization. They're always curious, and rightly so. What are they spending on programming? And then, the whole aspect of visitor experiences for those that are arts professionals. Is it a good visit or is it a bad visit? What kind of experience do you have in going to see an exhibition of artwork that's organized, or a collection, or a learning or educational program in that space? So to break those 3 down, programming at the largest private museums seems to be always the best and most professionally staffed. The bigger the organization, Louis Vuitton in Paris, any of the Pinot museums in Venice and now in Paris, the Broad Museum, the Rubel Museum of Art in Miami, they're huge. Their footprint is massive. They have thousands upon thousands of square meters of exhibition space. They run like some of the best museums, if not the best museums in the world. And even though their benefactors are involved to a certain extent with the programming, with the delivery of learning programs, they have real professionals running the organizations. That's not always the case. There's been many examples, and many times it's in the press, where a private collector thinks that they are the best museum director or curator. They organize something and it goes horribly wrong. And but they're business people. They're not trained in the arts. They're not trained in working with artists. They're not trained in installation or the way museums operate. So it's definitely, the bigger the organization, the better it is, to be quite honest with you. That's just my opinion. In terms of the budgets, it really also then comes down to some of the best organizations. There are so many also in Germany. I would say after the United States, Germany has the second biggest cluster. China is probably now exceeded that, but Germany has top 3 private spaces in the world. Some of them are very small. Some are housed in very small former homes, warehouses, former garages that are turned into spaces. But a lot of those kind of smaller spaces, operate on 75 to 100,000 US dollars or euros. And, some of the biggest ones, such as the Louis Vuitton Foundation or the Pinot museums, satellite of museums, you're looking at over 10 to 15 million US dollars or euros a year easily. I would say we will never find out because it's all private, but I would say with the Frank Gehry building just outside of the city center in Paris, the staffing, and I know many of the people on the staff there, there's over 150 people there. I mean, if I had to estimate, that budget is over 20 million euro, very easily. And with the type of exhibitions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, they do some of the best exhibits. And as we all know, organizing an exhibit does not come cheap or inexpensive. It takes a lot. And especially if you're working with parallel organizations such as, the Tate Museums, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Mori Museum in Tokyo, it costs a lot. Shipping, creating, organizing, travel, artist fees, the list just goes on and on. So, each institution is very, very different. And obviously it circles back to the ambitions of the collector or benefactor. Now, lastly, the visitor experiences, some of the best institutional programming comes from organizations that follow what I call a Chinese buffet restaurant mentality, where you go to a buffet and yes, it's all there and you pick and choose what you want. If you like egg rolls, you take a lot of egg rolls. If you like fried rice, well, you take more fried rice. I think institutions that follow that kind of strange model where there's many things to choose from seems to work best, especially in private museums. Public museums seem to have a pass card, that if you don't like something because it's private or public and has so little money, you go, it's the city museum. They can't do any better. But when you're a billionaire or a millionaire and you have a big company, you don't get that opportunity. And so a lot of the public organizations always have not one thing, even though that's not always the case. They usually have one or two or even three or four things, exhibitions, programming happen. So you could pick and choose, which is very good for the visitor because they can come into a space and really, really like something, and then a floor or in the same building, go into another gallery and see something that they cannot identify with and sometimes really hate. And I think both things are very, very good because at least there's a little bit of passion there. I loved it. It was amazing. Or, oh my gosh, I could not understand it. I never want to see that again. Those, I think, are good reactions. And public museums don't always have that luxury. Some do, most don't. But private museums really do well with that. And, it really then comes down to this whole aspect of, what is this Chinese buffet mentality all about? Well, it's about high and low culture, sometimes even having it at the same time. It's about populist and scholarly. So many people in the contemporary art world, just want an audience of 100 people. That's ridiculous. You want 110,000 people to come and visit you every month, not 100 people. But there are many in the museum world, and I know because many of my colleagues really want a small group. Yes, that comes with a scholarly exhibition, but populist is what gets people in the door and creates a buzz and reinforces a benefactor's positioning of why the organization exists. There's also this whole aspect of presentations or installations of the work, which really is heavily laden on the art that's there. So maybe it's an installation art, sculpture, but it ebbs from classic to theatrical. Many of us have visited a private space where something is just wild. An artist has taken over a whole gallery and there are things on the ceiling or video projections everywhere, to more classical where it's drawings and paintings on the wall. And it's a great experience, but it's very quiet. And of course, all of these things, as I'd mentioned, are extremely expensive to maintain, produce and maintain and organize. The Basquiat show that it was at Jean-Michel Basquiat that was organized by the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago now. Some of that work is extremely expensive. The insurance values, the transport, sending people with each painting. That was easily, very, very easily a $3 or $4 million exhibition, easily. But the numbers were huge. It seemed that everybody in Paris wanted to see that exhibition. So it worked out well for the foundation. And that's just something that, because they have a very dedicated and professional staff, that they've been able to calculate and project how these things function. Then it really comes down to, how do founders of contemporary spaces reflect on independent artistic visions? Many artists will come in, and it could be, Damien Hirst at the Pinchuk Art Center. It could be James Turrell at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. And they have a vision. They know what their exhibit will be like. They've been invited to do a project. They know and they really, try to work with the staff and the benefactor on how to move forward. So that's not easy, but it's something that is a real learning curve for a lot of benefactors and collectors, because artists are independent. They could care less. Thank you for buying my work. I like you for doing that, but I have my own vision. That does not always seem to go well with private collectors, but it definitely exists. And it happens all the time. Usually those are the kind of things we read about in the art press, where it either goes very, very right or very, very wrong. So, that's where we are. And, the way we can move forward is by really, I guess, setting more time on thinking about what a private space or collection is focused on doing now and in the future, now that we're post-COVID or almost post-COVID. And a lot of that has to do, and it always existed, is about programming, not to worry about staff politics and dynamics at our organization, not to worry about the money that's involved, not to worry about, the benefactor's whims or egos. What will help to clarify this kind of transitional mode, and private spaces are not going anywhere. They're not changing. They're here to stay. They've always been with us, but now they've taken a bigger part of the art world, contemporary art ecosystem. And that number will fluctuate, greater and smaller over time, but it's not something that will go away. So it really comes down to the programming and what ultimately these private spaces will be delivering in the future. And some will deliver wonderfully, and some will stay the course, and some will close because they never had a clear vision. And that's okay too. In my book this morning, before I got on this call with you, I looked over the 50 organizations that are in the book, and 6 have closed completely. Some are small, some were actually quite large, such as the Essen Museum in Vienna, where the government took over the collection and the museum. It changes. Just like businesses open and businesses close. Private museums run the same kind of economic, organizational kind of structure where some do really well and some don't. In COVID, I would say most of the private museums didn't change much because there was always financial stability behind them. Maybe staff, there were fluctuations in staff, but I would say on the whole, private spaces did extremely well during COVID shutdown compared to private or public spaces. So that's just something that I think there still will be ramifications from. But I think overall, private spaces are in good shape. The ebbs and flows of private museums really hasn't changed and will not change in the future. And that's, a private, individual, or family run. That's not changing. A lot of private spaces over the course of time or the death of a benefactor go from private to public. That has occurred many different times over the last 200 years, and that will continue to happen that way. There's also private spaces to charity or non-for-profits run by a group, a board, that exists. There's other nuances in this kind of a simplification, which I've outlined, but for the most part, that's how it is. There's many well-known organizations that you can go on your own and research that I think are very, very successful and have summarized a lot that I've been talking about. The Mori Museum in Tokyo is, not only a very active and dynamic organization, but it's also on top of the largest building in Tokyo, on the top floor. So the institutional, I guess, the person who started it, Manru Mori, built the building for his company and said, why would I put a museum at the base, which is usually the first thing anybody would do? I'm going to put it in the sky. And so organizations like that are really, once again, an offshoot of a benefactor's kind of dream. I mentioned earlier the Prada Foundation doing amazing exhibitions, very, very different, taking risks that most museums would not take. The Rubel Family Foundation in Miami, which is really went from very small family kind of collection to the biggest possibly museum now in Miami, which is, if you think about it, crazy that a private space would be larger than the public space. The Pinot Museum's top class, both the Palazzo Grassi, the Punta della Gondana, and now the new in the Bourse in Paris. I've not seen it, but the photos look amazing. Also, Pinot has always worked with Tadao Ando, the architect, and that's what visually ties all of his organizations or spaces together. That's just, a side note. So that's a real commitment that will not be going away. The Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, Guy and Miriam Ullens from Brussels, were the first to collect Chinese art in the late 90s and put together a great center and great collection. They've stepped away, and now it's a public space run by a board of collectors in Beijing, but that was extremely important. The Desta Foundation for Center for Contemporary Art in Athens and Hydra is both research and very unique in the way that they program. The programming in Athens is nice, but it's in an old warehouse. Not sexy, not interesting, but the research done there is great. The sexiness happens on their branch on the island of Hydra, where they invite many well-known artists to do something in something called the Slaughterhouse, which is actually a meat slaughterhouse on the edge of the city, which is a very small town. And they've turned it into contemporary art space. It has no doors. So each artist does something very bespoke and commissioned, and anybody can go in at any time, day or night, which is very unusual and very, very different. And because of COVID, it was supposed to be Jeff Koons this year, but now it'll be next year. But they've done many different programs with amazing artists. A few years ago, it was the video artist and filmmaker Doug Aiken from Los Angeles. It's fantastic. Obviously, the Louis Vuitton Foundation, which I mentioned earlier, Bernard Arnault does not seem to be stopping, not only in his business practices, but in his collecting and really making a robust organization. The Cartier Foundation, that has been around since the late 80s and has always made a presence, a very unique and kind of different program in Paris, non-traditional, kind of following that model of Chinese buffet, really presenting things that are different for people to come. There's the new Hall Foundation in Reading, Vermont, but also they have a castle in Hanover, Germany, and they do programming between the two locations. So now it's become a continental kind of a program. The Hughes Museum in Shanghai, started by the private collector Bundi Tech, amazing private museum. But then there's also organizations that are in change. And that's something for us to keep in mind. The Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, started as a project for Dasha Zhukova and Roman Abramovich. And now, sure, they give, but now it's become a city museum. And the dynamics and the exhibition program has changed. The focus has changed. It's a wonderful building, had a great start. But once again, if the benefactors are disengaged for whatever reason, the institution ebbs and flows and changes with the times. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, hybrid institutions. The Brandhurst in Munich, Museum Brandhurst, was a private collection. The collector, upon their death, gave money to the city and a major collection to build a museum. So the city took that upon themselves to do that. There's also a classic contemporary art private institution in Ghent, Belgium, the Herbert Foundation, or the Herbert Collection, started by Annick and Anton Herbert. They worked on this their whole lives. Not only the collecting, which they have an amazing collection, and it really goes from the mid 1970s to the late 80s at the most, maybe early 90s. So it's a very specific 20-year collection. Some of the best works by some of the best artists to be living at the time. But after they've assembled this and they've been kind of fine-tuning it, is they've spent a good 15, 20 years just working on the organization of of their space. After they die, they wanted to make sure every little detail was taken care of and addressed before their passing, which is extremely unusual. Then focused institutions such as Julia Stocha Collection, which only focuses in on new media and video in Dusseldorf. The Museum Sush, which is a relatively new museum, started 2 years ago by the Polish collector Kuzisk, who had a space called Art Stations in Poznań, Poland, and now has moved to Switzerland. The museum is run only by women and only exhibits women. If that's not focused, I don't know what is, but I've not been, but it looks very dynamic. And then obviously I mentioned earlier the Goetz Collection Foundation in Munich, started by Ingrid Goetz, who was a very successful art dealer in the 1970s and early 80s, but really highlights some of the most important work being done today. Soon to be open in Moscow by the VAC Foundation is the GS2, which will be probably the largest contemporary art space in Eastern Europe, and with a great staff and a very keen focus to putting Russian artists into a global context, which they do very well in Venice on a smaller scale. But that is good news for Russians because there hasn't been much activity recently in Russia because of the switch of the garage to kind of a city public space. So to conclude, the future is really good and very promising for private museums, setting aside the proper funding and endowments that benefactors and collectors need to do to carry on the exhibitions and programming after they pass or die, is where I think a lot of the activity and focus is happening right now. It's called estate planning, and where institutions are a larger part of the plan on the death of a benefactor, or the transition from this world to the other world, and it really, there's always politics, and there's always other dynamics involved, because there's families, there's spouses, whenever there's money, it's never an easy kind of situation. But for the most part, a lot of interest and a lot of time has been spent kind of on this financial component to the organization, to make sure that they run for in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, because that really is the challenge. Where will these organizations be 5, 10, 20, 50 years? And sometimes it's about creating a larger circle, be it local government, other collectors, different associations. But ultimately, the question will be, what kind of planning is taking place? What is the future thoughts of the benefactor, and what kind of dynamic can be sustained over the course of these years? So I thank you very much. That concludes my topic for today. I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of what organizations are doing, because there are so many. And as I mentioned, every year there seems to be more and more. And obviously, this is a topic that is not going to change much or go away anytime soon.
Дякую, Вікторе. Зараз ми можемо перейти вже на українську мову, ви нас добре розумієте. Дійсно, багато імен тих власників приватних установ, яких ви назвали, ви знаєте. Я, наприклад, особисто спілкувалася з Мартіном Марголісом, ми відвідували Cartier Foundation, і дійсно, коли бачиш цей розмах, і бачиш, наскільки іноді приватні колекції перевершують публічні музеї державні, це, хочеться сказати, under impression, що може зробити приватна ініціатива. І, до речі, якраз приклад Віктора Вічука говорить про те, що він дуже так мобільно і дуже швидко створив інституцію світового зразка. В той час, як в Україні, наприклад, ми до сих пір не маємо музею сучасного мистецтва, власного, держави. І зараз хочеться багато дискусій, вся спільнота обговорює, як це зробити, як залучити колекціонерів держави до участі у створенні цього музею. І отут, до речі, ваш досвід директора і взагалі одного з ініціаторів, я так розумію, нового музею, який був створений за вашою ініціативою Dallas Contemporary, де вам, я так розумію, вдалося залучити колекціонерів і інвесторів до створення цієї інституції. Дуже важливо, щоб ви поділилися, розказали, як це працює в Америці. І друге моє питання – це, спілкуючись з Мартіном, я питала, чому колекціонери, дійсно дуже багато інституцій виникає в Америці, і в Китаї, мабуть, є певна державна політика, яка підтримує меценатів. Це може бути і податкові пільги, це і держава, можливо, якимось чином мотивує колекціонерів до створення і підтримки інституцій. Не могли б поділитися своїм досвідом, інформацією щодо цього питання?
Я б сказав би, що я читаю по українські газети на інтернеті. Я думаю, що це є добра розмова, дискусія, збудувати музей новий у Києві, але це також є фантазія. Збудувати музей, що таке як гараж у Москві або у Парижі, це що Піно зробив, це crazy гроші, це 75 мільйонів євро. І тоді то ще тоді буде без колекції. І тоді мати бюджет на кожен рік, щоб підтримувати ті, що працюють там, виставки. Це вже запізно колекції будувати для уряду, щоб новий музей будувати. Бо уряд ніколи такі гроші не дозволить. Зараз на Україні є війна, зараз є багато людей, що підтримку потребують. І ніхто там у Раді або ніякий президент, хоч вони будуть підтримувати щось таке збудувати, ніколи дадуть гроші, що потрібні зробити такий world class. То ніколи не станеться. І то я б сказав би, бо я працював на Україні для Віктора Пенчука, я знаю багато колекціонерів. Я думаю, що у майбутньому то багато тиск буде на колекціонерів, бо вони стануть як вони такий по-англійському сказати, foundation, батон для сьогоднішньої культури і для художників. І так, це несправедливо, це не легко, але, на жаль, це так буде. Знову, усе добре мати дискусії, але це тоді, як Альберт Айнштейн, говорити за математику, що це все тільки на папері буде. І знову це одне, що далеко ніхто не мусить йти на інтернеті сісти, хто на аукціоні усі ці робіт купляє, що є найліпші і найдорожчі. Я б сказав, вже може 15 років я не бачу один музей. Чи це може найбільший музей на цілий світ. Не можуть вже купити на аукціону картину або скульптуру, або що-небудь. Ці дні вже пройшли. То тільки залишилось колекціонери. І так, багато дають ті робіт до музеїв, але тепер багато не дають. І так, ви маєте рацію, що уряд мусить щось змінити тут у Америці. Є дуже таке позитивне, що як даєш гроші або роботу до музею, до урядний музей, то видатки тоді не платиш на ту суму. І як хтось купить картину, художник X, і та картина є 100 євро, але тоді 20 років пізніше той художник дуже знаний, і та картинка тепер є 10 мільйон євро, він може то, чи вона з видатків прямо понижити. То є позитивно, а то дуже таке по-американському. У Англії таке не існує, міняється там трошки. Є рух, у Франції трошки міняється, бо є рух, але це нічого таке швидко не станеться. Я думаю, що зробити таку якусь, що уряд може зробити якусь таку парасольку фінансову, щоб допомогти колекціонерам, і то може статися у всяких ситуацій, щоб допомогти зробити такий позитивний атмосфер, що робота може залишитись на Україні, що вони не мусять за кордон висилати, бо вони турбуються, чи що станеться, чи як уряд переміниться, чи тоді будуть проблеми. Також такі позитивні хвилі давати, що колекціонери, як зараз стається з Помпіду, тепер вже є пов'язані з світові програми, Це знов уряд може, я думаю, що більше допомогти, вони вже мають ті контакти. І багато можна зробити, але знов це не буде легко. Це багато говорять за стіл, але нічого не стається. І це тільки візьме або один міністр, або один президент, або одна рада почати, щоб це більше, ніж тільки розмова була.
Дякую за відповідь. І в нас ще залишилося 15 хвилин нашої сесії. І я запрошую наших слухачів, якщо у вас є питання, будь ласка, можна поговорити і задати Пітеру. Побажаю. Семен, не хочете? Бо у вас якраз власна інституція. У нас, до речі, сьогодні присутні представники, наприклад, Семен Кантор, директор Одеського музею сучасного мистецтва, це приватна інституція. І одна з найбільших колекцій в Україні, але з нашого регіону Одеси. Семен, можливо, приєднаєтесь, задасте питання? Підходьте, якраз Пітер вас побачив.
Давайте я.
Да.
Петр, здравствуйте.
Добрий день.
Оп,
Да.
он едет. Не так легко.
Це для мого зросту.
Это очень аккуратно. Извините, так, это не у меня.
Все нормально.
Я прошу прощения, у меня достаточно плохой украинский, хотя понимать я понимаю отлично. Я очень внимательно слушал и почувствовал понимание ваших болевых точек, которые есть на Украине. Я не очень понял, может быть, я пропустил, потому что я пришел на ваше выступление чуть позже. Как, вот Наталья задала этот вопрос, но вы не полностью на него ответили, мне кажется. Как помогают государства частным музеям реальности за рубежом? Какие податковые пільги? С чем они связаны? Со стоимостью самих работ или с бюджетом музея текущим? Например, вот у нас в Украине Украинский культурный фонд, вот до того, как его развалили, выделил деньги, так называемую институциональную поддержку, институциональная підтримка. Мы получили грант, но когда мы написали о том, что мы платим деньги не музею, платим деньги за аренду собственнику, который является учредителем этого музея, нам сказали, что за это нам государство деньги. Это не компенсирует, это коммерческая прибыль с нашего учредителя. И мне было очень смешно это слышать, но это было. И нам дают деньги только на институциональную поддержку, только на зарплату сотрудников, да и то, когда они проводят какие-то ивенты. И не более того. А как организована такого рода деятельность в нормальных странах?
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Дякую. Ну, я тільки хотів додати, що воно так тяжко. Я розумію, що на Україні діється, бо я не останній рік, але кожен рік їду 2-3 рази на Україну. І виставки тут роблю у Деласі і по цій Америці з українськими художниками. То я розумію і відчуваю і позитивні, і негативні речі, але також це така світова проблема, що є ті, що такі по ковід розуміють, як зараз Англія тільки що помогла усі музеї у Англії, уряду Англії, щоб якось ці дірки вилізли. щоб більше людей взяти на роботу, щоб ліпше виставки робити, ліпші каталоги. Ну, це таке, це скрізь не стається. Тут у Америці, то ті, що гроші, це більше приватні гроші йдуть для музеїв, то я б сказав би, на підтримку спонсорів є, так, але всі тепер після COVID то наполовину дають і не планують міняти те, що раніше було. То раніше давали 100 тисяч євро, а тепер тільки 50. І то ніколи, вони вже мені казали, то не зміниться. Ми назад не вертаємося, ми любимо все, що ви робите, більше робіть, але це тепер така світова проблема, що і усякі такі системи по цілій світі на Україні, чи тут у Америці, я б сказав би, погіршується, ніж поліпшується. Буде, я думаю, що добрі речі ставатися в майбутньому, але не за рік, не за 2, не за 5. Бо усе міняється, світ міняється, і музеї, і структури музею багато не мінялося. Так, приватні інституції, private spaces змінили, але публічні чи уряд, то зараз добре не буде працювати. І також спонсорів, хоч то щось нове на Україні, по цілий світ, вони також турбуються за їхній заробіток, і усе є таке, по-англійському сказати, hot mess. І я думаю, що це, знову, трошки часу візьме, але я думаю, що ми мусимо усі працювати на ці речі, і може якісь позитивні знаки будуть, як нам це змінити, щоб добра підтримка була не тільки для музеїв, але також для художників, за що ми дуже зацікавлені добрий контакт мати.
Пітер, дуже дякую. І ще одне питання. Скажіть, будь ласка, от ви підтримуєте зв'язки з українськими художниками, тільки що згадали, так? І взагалі Dallas Contemporary. Музей, він є державним, публічним, чи він існує і діє на допомогу приватному пулу колекціонерів, патронів? Це перше питання. І друге, у зв'язку з ковід, от як ви бачите майбутнє музею? На чим ви зараз працюєте? Можливо, проекти, які ви готуєте? Просто цікаво більше дізнатися про вас.
Я думаю, що мої останні 25, вже 30 років я все з українськими художниками працював. Де я не жив у Америці, який музей я не працював, все було включений. Ілля Чичкана першу виставку розробив у 98-й рік, і це ніколи не мінялося. Я думаю, що є трошки інакше. Я кожну виставку не робить різницю, хто був художник чи яку. І це 2 венеційські бієнале назад, як ми тут зорганізували із Борис Михайлова, і це куратор тут Лілія зі мною це зробила, хто також є від України. Ми всі приватні гроші це збирали. Або фонд якийсь у Нью-Йорці, або тут у Даллас, або геть зовсім інакше що зробили, що ті, що були зацікавлені поїхати до Венеції, ми зробили таку VIP-екскурсію, що вони мусили платити 10 тисяч до 15 тисяч доларів прямо до музею, щоб на цю екскурсію, і за все інше, за їхні подорожі, за їжу. То ми назбирали так, ми мали там 15 людей по 15 тисяч доларів, то багато помогло. Чи Лілія і я хотіли з цими людьми, колекціонерами по Венеції ходити? Абсолютно ні. Але ми мусимо таке робити, щоб нову базу зробити, як заплатити за виставку. І то таке постійно ми тут робимо. Це є банки, діаспора українські, що час від часу допомагають. Діаспора не дуже допомагає, бо вони ще дуже за вишиванки, що добре, і писанки турбуються. Але щось дуже такого нового, то трошки тяжко їх побачити, чому їм то підтримувати. То справді сказати, ми тоді постійно питаємо фондів у Нью-Йорці чи в Америці, і також американців, що зацікавлені з українськими художниками. То зараз, як ми працюємо у майбутньому, я думаю, що від мені тут у Далласі, що потрібно, я більше по Україні, хоч у Америці, я постійно у новинах. Чи то колишній президент, дурництво до президента України говорив, чи це війна, чи не робить. Україна, всі у Америці тепер усі Україну знають. І це дуже велика зміна за дуже короткий час. І що я думаю, я постійно колекціонерами питаю, що зараз діється на Україні. То вони хочуть бачити, що художник робить. Зараз справді не є такий веб-сайт добрий, де вони можуть таке бачити, чи журнал, чи книжку. То я думаю, що моя думка є дуже попрацювати або на одну книжку, або може аж на дві, за що діється з художниками на Україні. Бо це хоч таке класичний такий шлях, такий каталог чи книжку, але я думаю, що для колекціонера це таке нормальне. Інтернет, то більше людей будуть пов'язані, будуть включати, але це таке не таке суперсерйозне, як книжка є. То я над цим зараз думаю, як це найліпше буде. І я думаю, що буду працювати у ту сторону.
Дуже дякую за змістовну лекцію. Я думаю, що сьогодні наші слухачі і ті, хто в майбутньому побачить ще запис лекцій, дізнаються дуже багато про корупційні практики кордону, про приватний простор. Я нагадаю, що ми прослухали взагалі доповідь, лекцію Пітера Дорошенка, і в нього, до речі, є книжка «Приватний простір для сучасного мистецтва», яку можна ще придбати на Амазоні, і якраз більш детально знайомитися з тією інформацією, яку Пітер сьогодні поділився з нами. Я дуже дякую вам, Пітер, за час, за те, що ви знову прийняли участь у форумі колекціонерів, організованому М17 та Українським клубом колекціонерів сучасного мистецтва. І якщо ви плануєте бути в Україні, для нас буде надзвичайно цінно бачити вас у нас і з задоволенням познайомити з нашими колекціонерами. І я впевнена, що знову таки ваш досвід для нас усіх буде дуже цінний. Так що чекаємо вас на Україні, або маємо надію скоро побачити десь на якихось арт-подіях.
Так, абсолютно. Дякую вам. Майте добрий день.
До побачення.
До побачення. Дякую.